I'm talking about the world Christopher Columbus did not discover. But I'm talking about what Christopher Columbus set in motion, because he set in motion, in his period set in motion, an act of criminality that influences our very life today. It laid the basis for Western racism. It laid the basis for misconceptions about people. It laid the basis for extensive use of organized religion as a rationale for the enslavement of people. It's a reoccurring event in history. And it told us, as if nothing has told us before, that history is never old. Everything that ever happens continues to happen. What we are dealing with now is more than the second rise of Europe. We're dealing with the rise of a concept that has taken hold of the mind of most of the world, and people throughout the world are now fighting to get away from that concept, and a whole lot of people are prisoners to that concept. We're dealing with the reason certain things looked as though they were going to succeed and did not succeed. We're actually dealing with the reason why the African independence explosion did not culminate in independence, while the civil rights movement did not culminate in any civil rights, and where the Caribbean Federation did not culminate in any independence for Caribbean states. Independence in name only, flag independence, but actual economic independence, they are more dependent now than they were at the height of colonialism. It set in motion the exposure of the fact that once you are oppressed and once certain information is kept from you, you begin to experience some confusion about what independence consists of. Now, let's look at the world before Columbus. Then let's pick up Columbus's world and look at his impact on the Americas, and look at the world he did not discover. But what he actually did, and he should be credited for this, he set in motion the exploitation of two continents for European domination. He never set foot on North America or South America. He set in motion an attitude that is still with us, a concept called divine white right, and something else called manifest destiny. The assumption, because Europeans had the ships and the basic technology, they had the right to go into other people's country, exploit their mineral resources, to take and rape their women at will. And they did all of this in the name of a God that they said was merciful and kind. All of them using Western Orient religions, and that includes the Arabs, made their God ungodly. Now, the role of religions in the domination and the destruction of African civilization, all of them, and there's no exception. Islam being as ruthless as all the rest of them. The role of religions in this matter is so shameful. No matter how you look at it, the picture is negative, because all of them did more harm than good. Now let's look at the world, 1400 to 1600, before we come to what is called the New World, that was not new at all. During the Crusades, the Europeans had exploited each other to the point where Europe was about to explode within itself. The Catholic Church, in its need for funds to build these massive cathedrals and to support parasitical priests, had begun to fleece the people to the point where they began to have some serious questions about the role of the church. The church, in its desire to get still more money from the people, created something called purgatory. Now, when you died, you didn't go directly to heaven. You went to purgatory, and people had to pray you from purgatory into heaven. And the more money you gave the priest, the harder, the quicker he prayed to get grandma and uncle from purgatory into heaven. It was a religious con game played on the people of Europe. They were beginning to discover this con game to the point, out of anger, Europe was about to explode within itself. Then a fortunate incident would happen. Offbeat beatnik hermit Peter came across Europe saying that the infidel Arabs were barring Europeans from visiting the holy places and observing the Holy Grail and the places of the crucifixion. Now, Michael Bradley, in a still-to-be-published book, have proven that there was no Holy Grail in the first place. It wasn't lost in the second place. And it wasn't what they thought it was in the third place. Now, the Pope saw a reason he could use to cut down on all of this anger against the church. The propaganda swept through Europe that they had to move across Europe in a crusade to rescue this mythological Holy Grail that wasn't lost in the first place. Now they started to march, moving across Europe to the rescue. But in the movement across Europe, they forgot the pent-up anger against the church. And this gave the church a leash on life that would last until the rise of Martin Luther, who would challenge him again and lay the basis of Protestantism. Now, there were many crusades, many reasons for people going on crusades, none of which had anything to do with religion or God. Now, the way the story is presented to you in school, you think it has something to do with holiness. It has something to do with European power and Europe rising from the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. Europe's search for something outside of Europe to eat. European emotionalism venting itself on people outside of Europe. Europe trying to find a scapegoat for its own anger. Europe trying to defect the fact of its own enslavement of other Europeans. Now they would call it feudalism, but it was enslavement. European enslavement of other Europeans. Now, while the Crusades won the battles in the movie, Cecil B. DeMille gave them victory. In many cases, they got hell beaten out of them. Now, because these well-dressed lords took with them common, ordinary people to do their work in their laundry, these common, ordinary people saw these lords with their tails being beaten, on their knees begging for mercy, and he understood that this man who owned the land and controlled his life was less than God. In the meantime, back in Europe, the young lords had given up a privilege that the old lords were hanging on to, the privilege of first night. If you lived on his land and you married, he had the privilege of spending the first night with your wife. The young lords had conceded that the poor critter should at least have that privilege. And so now, when the old lords came back into Europe, there was a semblance of human recognition for the serf or the plain white slave on the plantation. This semblance of human recognition would lead to more demand, lead to a fight against child labor, lead to, while it didn't lead to the banishment of prostitution, it would lead to workhouses and places where they could be at least put people out of sight. Europe had lost 1/3 of its population through famine and plagues. Now, on the eve of 1400 AD, this is the sight you see in Europe, far less in creature comfort than anything in Africa and in Asia. Engaged in Europe in tribal warfare that they are engaged in right now. Only in Europe, you don't call it tribal warfare. You will not deal with the fact that not only what is happening in Russia is in part, tribal warfare is part of race war. You forgot the millions of Asians who went into Russia, went into Europe and didn't go home. Asian men who came without women and didn't go home to satisfy that biological necessity. Indeed, if it is a necessity all the time, well, that's another lecture, but I think we've overdone that assumption. I think what is a biological pleasure is not always a biological necessity. Let's at least concede that much. Well, anyway, these Europeans intermingle with these Asians to create a European ethnic entity that's still in Europe. But Europe was still hungry. While it was awakening, it began to pay some attention to the new light in Europe, and the only light in Europe was in the Mediterranean area, then dominated by Africans, Arabs, and Berbers. The Africans were totally in control of Spain, parts of France, and Portugal, for the African had left 1240 AD. But in 1415 AD, the Portuguese got up enough nerve to attack a small place on the coast of Africa, a place called Satra. Now, as battles go, it wasn't much of a battle, and as places go, it wasn't much of a place. I visited the place, and some say it's about the size of Central Park, and I walked all over it. It's not as big as Central Park. But the Battle of Satra was a turning point because after 7/11, when an African general, Jabir al-Taraq, Taraq bin Azad, led an army into Spain, Spain had been under the domination of Africans, Berbers, and Arabs. And Europe had lived in fear of what they referred to as the infidel Arabs in the Mediterranean. Being blocked from the trade in the Mediterranean, Europe cringed, and it is this African Berber and this Arab that drove the European into the so-called Middle Ages by destroying the markets in the Mediterranean. With the Battle of Satra, the European had asserted himself and began to claim access to the Mediterranean. All right, 1455, arguments between the Africans and the Arabs over puritanical approaches to women had weakened the African-Arab hold on Spain and the Mediterranean. They also had puritanical religious arguments, because when the African joins a religion, he is a Puritan within that religion. Other people join a religion and use it for their best interests. But when the African joins it, he takes it in its purest form. I have said before, we will out-pope the Pope and we will out-Muhammad Muhammad. We are the true believers. Amen. We are the only people naive enough to believe in Christianity and democracy. Yes. Other people know it's not going to work. Don't play around with it. Know full well it's not going to work. All right, now, Spain and Portugal would now approach the Pope, and the Pope would say to them, you two good Catholic nations, stop fighting among yourselves. You're both authorized to reduce to servitude all infidel people. You should read Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery. A lot of people think it's an old chestnut. Why must I read that old book? That old book, written over 40 years ago, has some of the most concise information on how and why the slave trade came, of any book that's so far been written. Brian David Bryan, a scholar at Cornell University, wrote a book called Slavery in Western Civilization, 3 times larger, and said less. All right, my point here is that there is a forgotten character that had not been taken into consideration. I'm still on my way to Christopher Columbus. Prince Henry, the navigator. Prince Henry got a catch of maps, mostly made by Jewish gold dealers who have been dealing with gold in the Western Sudan and in the coast of West Africa. The Western Sudan are the nations in inner West Africa, as against the coastal nations of West Africa. Europe is beginning to see the shape of certain parts of Africa. They're no longer guessing on all of it. Now, with these maps, Prince Henry began to open up a school for chart making and map making to let the European know something about the other parts of the world. I recently appraised a book they called Prince Henry, the Starter of the Slave Trade, which is inaccurate. But he did set European maritime skill in motion using the maritime information the Africans and the Arabs had preserved at the University of Salamanca in Spain. Europe now would go back to sea. It had previously forgotten longitude and latitude. In other words, if they put a ship out to sea, they wouldn't know which way to turn it. Didn't know east from west. That challenge from Africa, from Mediterranean Africa, that challenge of the Moors, that challenge of the Arabs, had driven Europe into the Middle Ages and had dulled the senses of Europe to the fact that they lived now in fear. Prince Henry, while called the navigator, didn't navigate anything, and there is no evidence that he ever went to sea. The main thing Prince Henry did is to introduce Europe to maritime information, and the European in turn used the maritime information coming out of China, then the leading maritime nation of the world, to go out to sea again and to get rid of some of his old wise tales about the sea, and that if you go so far, the sea drops off, and that the land was, that the wood was round or flat. But the European had begun to make up his mind. All the hunger, all the famine. Now that he's got ships, he's got guns, he didn't care what shape the wood was in, round or flat, I want it all. And round or flat, he's going to take it all. And you keep approaching someone thinking somebody out of their goodness going to give up something they took from you. They took it from you, you got to take it back. This is what makes me nervous about that South African thing. We keep saying about one man, one vote. You got one man, one vote in the United States, you ain't got no democracy. You got one man, one vote, you still got homeless people. You got one man, one vote, you still ain't got no job. So what one man, one vote gonna get you? You talk about multiracialism, call for total African power. If anybody can't live under African power, then show him where the airport is, show him where the shipyard is, or show him where the graveyard is. Because you have to go. No argument. No argument. You got to go. I like Nelson Mandela, but he makes me nervous. He have not called for the return of the land. No land, no nation. Okay, now back to the groove of the talk. The most important thing is that a little-known sailor, Christopher Columbus, attended one of Prince Henry's school of chart making. And there where he learned the basis of maritime skill. Now, we have no evidence that he had or ever had any command. Now, this gets us into a mystery about Columbus. Michael Bradley, in a new work called The Columbus Conspiracy, found so much dirt under the name Columbus, he maintains that there were two Columbuses. No one man could have been capable of that much dirt, including 7 illegitimate children. Because when he spaced where the children were born and the different women, he couldn't have moved that fast from one to the other. If he saw one over here, he couldn't have gotten over here fast enough to bring that one in the world. All right. Now, we have to deal with another date neglected in history. 1482. Ships land off the coast of what is now Ghana, later the Gold Coast, earlier the Gold Coast. They insist now on building permanent fortifications. Portuguese ships had been coming along that coast since 1438. They would take a few slaves out of the country. 1442. The Portuguese king, seeing these slaves so well dressed, and seeing them bringing presents from home, gave them presents and sent them home. The idea of enslavement had not reached his mind. The Portuguese enslavers thought the king was crazy, had his head shaved and sent him to a monastery. Got another king who could think better about the trade. Now, all right. The important thing about this trip, when they forced their way into Ghana, an African king, King Asa, differed with them and told them, if we saw each other infrequently, maybe we could maintain our friendship. Too much familiarity would erode our friendship. He was beginning to see what could happen. And then, in the beautiful last lines of his speech, he said, the sea is forever pushing against the land, and the land with equal obstinacy is forever pushing against the sea. He understood what could happen. But those Portuguese who couldn't sell him the Bible story forced that gun story on him, and they forced their way in and built Elmina Castle, the first of the great slave forts along the coast of Ghana. If 36 of the 42 slave fortresses are in Ghana, this tells you that Ghana was the headquarters of the slave trade. My point of mentioning this is that there's some evidence to indicate that Christopher Columbus was a part of this expedition. He says in his diary, as man and boy, I sailed up and down the Guinea coast for 23 years. What was he doing up and down the coast of West Africa for 23 years? He was in the early Portuguese slave trade. This is Christopher Columbus. Now let's go to 1492. Because in 1492, other things happened other than the alleged discovery that was not a discovery at all. Let's deal with two African events that helped to set certain things in motion. 1492, Spain was whitening up through the marriage of Queen Isabella and Ferdinand. They began now to expel the Moors, the Africans, and the Arabs. If they expelled the Jews, and they did, that means they did not consider the Jews white. For most of the Jews were Sephardics. The same descendant of these Sephardic Jews are second-class citizens in Israel right now, though they are the majority in the population. Not a single field officer in the Israeli army is a Sephardic, though they are the majority in the army. The army is dominated by whites. Same is true of the Russian army. You got millions of Orientals in Russia. I'm showing you that whites play the white game, left or right, no matter what they say they believe religiously, no matter what they say they believe politically, they play the race game. You have over 30 million Muslims in Russia. And Russia is declared atheist nation. Now, Christopher Columbus, in this voyage, this early voyage, would have set in motion. Now, the expulsion of the Africans and the Arabs from Spain would set also in motion the Inquisition. And one of the great stick-up games in history, when certain Spaniards would tell certain people, especially the grandees, the money managers of Spain, mostly Sephardic Jews, give me the money, I'll go to the gallows. Many Jews converted to Catholicism, practiced Catholicism by day and Judaism by night. They were called Merinos, or the silent Jews. Some of their descendants still live. Some of their descendants are still permanent. The best known of their descendants, Fidel Castro. There's a good book on it, published in France. It hadn't been in English translation. Fidel Castro and his family, tracing his family back to the Merinos. Now, he would go through the motion of being Catholic even now, playing that wise game. But this expulsion would do Spain more harm than good, because the grandees brought into Spain by the Africans and the Arabs were doing a pretty good job of managing Spain's money. When you expel them, Spain has never had a strong economic system since then. Spain had killed the goose that laid the egg. Hadn't got itself together since then. I can say across the board, maybe except for Cuba, show me a Spanish-speaking country and you will show me a sloppy, economically run country. Any place in the world. If anybody know a well-run Spanish-speaking country? Name it. Never got themselves together. Well, all right. Now, Another event would happen within Africa, within inner West Africa, the Western Sudan. The Emperor of the Songhai Empire, Soni Ali, would be killed coming home from a minor war in the south. He's drowned when his horse got entangled. Now the great independent states in Africa beginning to fall. These states are not coastal states. These are inner West African states. These states could have rescued West Africa and saved them from the slave trade. They would go on to a height of grandeur in the midst of the slave trade and in spite of the slave trade. Now, 1492, Christopher Columbus setting out for the New World. Now let's ask some questions. This man has had no command position. He has not even been a petty officer. How then did this obscure sailor become admiral of the ocean seas for the Spanish nation? Who is behind this? Why is it that Christopher Columbus sailed from Spain the same week the Spanish expelled the Jews? Who exactly was Christopher Columbus? Was he sailing out ahead? Michael Bradley and others have now located those who financed the ships. All Jewish bankers who were told, give me your money or give me your life. They were the chief translators on the boat. He was to go to Asia. Why didn't he go to Asia? Sailing up and down the Guinea coast, West Africa, he had discovered from African sailors who had already gone to the New World, there was a possibility of gold in another direction. He turned his ships in another direction. He also discovered that there was a current in the sea. You'd pick it up at a certain time of year, it would push you almost straight into the West Indies. And he picked that current. That current took him there. This is why his ships were lost coming back, because he came back too soon. The current reverses itself once every 6 months. This is why he ended up in Portugal on his way back. But once he got there, and you should read Eric Williams' documents on West Indian history. This is the most underrated Caribbean scholar. Most people underrate him because they didn't like the way he ran Trinidad. I don't know how he ran Trinidad. I know he's a damn good researcher, one of the finest of the Caribbean researchers. And I want to